Hi everyone, thanks for coming today. We'll make a start. We have got some more people booked, so they can just sort of squash in as they arrive. But like I said, thanks for coming today. So on our seminar today, our Hive seminar, we have 3 speakers lined up for you. The observant amongst you will notice that there are just 2 people sat there. Our third speaker, he's teaching at the moment, but he's on his way, running down, I think, from the Freeman Centre, so will join us soon. So I'll introduce the 3 of them, and then we'll get started. So first of all, we have Enrico Scalas. He's Professor of Statistics and Probability here at Sussex, and he'll be discussing models that have been developed to look at wealth distribution and how empirical studies can be performed on these models. Hopefully that's an accurate description of what you're going to be talking about. We've also got Mehrbod, and she's commissioning editor for Sage Publications, and she'll be sharing with us the publisher perspective on big data and its impact on social science research. And then joining us shortly will be Chris Marsden. He's Professor of Internet Law here at Sussex, and he's going to talk about Open Law's EU project, which is a project he's been involved in, trying to harness new technology to improve legal access to information across borders. So what we'll do is we'll hear from all 3 speakers and then take lots of questions from you at the end, if that's okay. Do it in that way. Just to let you know, while you're all here, and I have a captive audience, so this is the second of the 4 Hive seminars. We have 2 more to come. So next week, but actually on a Friday, not a Thursday, but we have, it's called Has the Tide Turned to Responsible Metrics in Research? So that should be a really interesting one, especially in light of some of the metrics discussions people are having ahead of the next Research Excellence Framework exercise. And after that, just on the 2nd of April, so back to a Thursday, we've got one which is titled Reproducible Research? I should have said that differently. Reproducible Research. And we've got 2 speakers there. We've got Zoltan Din from Psychology and Janet Boddy from Education and Social Work speaking in that one. So that should be really interesting too. Questions around making research reproducible and sharing it and reuse issues. I'm going to hand over now to Enrico.
Yes, so thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you very much for coming also today to this series of short presentations on data-related topics. So when I was asked, I was thinking carefully, because I'm actually working on stochastic processes, which are sort of like, I don't know if you know Brownian motion or things like that. So, and from a theoretical point of view, so I'm maybe generating data using Monte Carlo simulations, but I'm not really working, despite the statistics name in the name of my position, I'm a probabilist, not a statistician. However, we have recently started international collaboration, which also includes data analysis that we are going to discuss a bit later. So the bulk of this presentation is theoretical, and also I will skip several mathematical details that are here for completeness, and maybe if you have questions, I can use the transparencies. I understand I also have sort of 15 minutes, so the presentation is actually divided into 2 parts: a motivation part, and then the presentation of a very simple stylized model for the distribution of wealth, and then there is also some display of data analysis that we have preliminarily done. So the motivation for our research is, this question is, why is there wealth inequality? So if you go to the classics in economics, you find this course of political economics by Vilfredo Pareto, where he addressed this question. This is a book written, despite Pareto was Italian, he was working in a French-speaking environment, so the book has been written, I guess, in French. And however, I will translate this French sentence because it's quite interesting. So Pareto's book is mainly dealing with the distribution of income rather than wealth, but he also addresses the problem of wealth, and we are now also discussing the similarities between the analysis with wealth and income very briefly at the end. So we have in mind essentially that wealth is a stock and income is a flux or a flow of wealth is individually defined. So our individual wealth is defined essentially by our individual balance sheet. We may have assets, which is whatever we are owner of, and liabilities. We might have loans, for instance. These are liabilities, and the difference between assets and liabilities is essentially our wealth. So it's possible it is, if we are indebted, that this is negative. But we will discuss also this issue briefly. So, however, when we look at the division of wealth or the repartition, so it's sort of the division of wealth within the general population, we find a lot of inequality there, and this was already known at the time of Pareto. And if you look at human characteristics, there is not such an inequality. So how is that this inequality arises if we are more or less the same individual? So we are not very different from one another. And according to Pareto, there are three determinants for the wealth distribution. One is the human nature itself, then the organization of the society, and then he has somehow reluctantly to admit that also chance is a determinant of the wealth distribution. My point of view is that, on the contrary, human nature is not very relevant. I mean, maybe a little bit, but not much. The organization of the society is very relevant, because if we are taking wealth from the poor and giving it to the rich, we will create a more and more uneven and unfair society. But also, despite our organization, also chance is a major determinant of inequality. So this long transparency is setting the model ideas. So we have economic agents. They can be individuals, households, or also companies. And each agent is endowed with a stock, for instance, wealth. And we assume here that the stock is positive, so we do not consider in our model indebtedness. If there is indebtedness, this has a lower bound. So we can remove this lower bound, and so that all the wealth are positive. So this is the point of view why we can also use positive variables. Then, of course, if you have n agents in a society, you sum their wealth, you get the total wealth, and now you are interested in the distribution of the vector W1, Wn, where this vector is representing the distribution of wealth, essentially. But if for any reason all the agents are on a par, so technically there is a condition which is called exchangeability, then you can also marginalize this distribution of the vector on a single variable, and you get, again, a distribution of wealth. Notice that you can always consider a transformation in which you divide the individual wealth by the total wealth available in the society, so you get a partition of the interval 0, 1. If you divide that relationship by 1, you get that the sum of the xi's is 1, and you have a finite random partition technically of the interval 0, 1. Now, two things. In our model, we are considering n and w being constant. This is not a great limitation. If you are concerned with fractions, if wealth increases in time, fractions will move depending on the distribution of these fractions by themselves. So it's not a great issue to have a change of wealth. Of course, the demographic dynamic can be an issue, because you can have that the number of agents is increasing or decreasing. But if the demographic dynamics is slow, also the assumption of a constant number of agents is not bad. So, having said that, here is a summary of several of the things I have done, I have mentioned, but we can move to the model itself. So this is a technical framework. Essentially, this distribution of the fractions will be on a multidimensional triangle. It's called the simplex technically, which is defined by these equations, and which means that the wealth fractions move into a compact subset of Rn, which is this delta n minus 1. Yes, there is always this sum, so the xi's are the last of the xi's will be 1 minus the sum of the n minus 1 xi's. Now, in order to model dynamics on this multidimensional object, on this simplex, we define two moves. One is coagulation and one is fragmentation. By coagulation, we denote the aggregation of the stocks of two or more agents into a single stock. This is a case of mergers, acquisitions, and so on in economics. And then we have the fragmentation, in which we consider the division of the stock of one agent into two or more stocks. This is the case of inheritance, default, etc. Now, this is technical. If you have a coagulation and you merge two the wealth of two agents, or the fraction of wealth of two agents, you move from the simplex delta n minus 1 to the simplex delta n minus 2. So you change sort of the geometric object on which you are living. But when you are then fragmenting by splitting into two parts the wealth of one agent, you move from delta n minus 2 to delta n minus 1. So by combining coagulations and fragmentations, you move essentially always on the same multidimensional object, the same simplex. And our model that we are proposing here is very simple. The first move is a random selection of two agents. So you toss a coin from one, or a die which has n faces. You get a number and you select the first agent, and then from the other n minus 1 agents you select another agent, again uniformly, and you merge them. And then this merged wealth is divided into two parts according to this rule. You draw from the uniform distribution a random number between 0 and 1, and the new wealth of agent I will be ux, where x is the sum xi xj before, and the wealth of the new agent, the new wealth of the agent xj will be 1 minus ux. In this way, you have total conservation of the number of agents and the total conservation of wealth. This is one possible dynamics. Of course, there are many other dynamics, and we are interested in several things. So this is essentially representing in a single formula what we are doing. So we are merging xi xj, and then the new xi at step t plus 1 will be given by this formula, and the new xj at step t plus 1 will be given by that formula. So this is defining a specific stochastic process which takes the name of Markov chain. So it has an infinite state space because it is the state space is on this simplex somehow, non-denumerable, but the dynamics is time discrete. So it's a very difficult thing to do is to characterize whether this dynamics leads us to some equilibrium distribution. So you have this dynamics, you repeat it again and again, starting from some state, etc. And then what happens to the distribution, for instance, of the multivariate vector of the x's, so xi's. And it turned out, first of all, that you can prove that the uniform distribution on the simplex is invariant with respect to this dynamics. So if you start from uniformly distributed fractions, you will end into uniformly distributed fractions. And then, by using some technical tools of Markov chain theory, which I am skipping here, but you can prove that this uniform distribution is also the equilibrium distribution. So you start from any state, you let the Markov chain evolve, and this is stabilizing into a Markov chain where the fractions of wealth are distributed according to the uniform distribution on the simplex. So this is a very simple case, even if the mathematics is not so simple. But what can we say about the distribution of wealth? So in this model, all the agents are exchangeable, are on a par. So you can essentially, to get the distribution of wealth, take the distribution of the vector and marginalize on a single agent. And any one of the agents is equivalent, so you can take the first one. If you do so, for the first fraction, you get this nice result that you have a beta distribution for the wealth. So the beta distribution is a distribution with complex support between 0 and 1, and because these fractions are numbers between 0 and 1, but essentially the behavior of the beta distribution resembles the behavior of a gamma distribution. So it means that this sort of distribution has exponential tails. And it is represented quite well, the behavior of the bulk distribution. But the tail of the distribution, where you have richer people, it's this model is not capturing the real behavior of the tail of the distribution. Why? Because the tail of the distribution is approximately described by a power law. To illustrate this point, so it means that this model gives us a fairer society. It captures the behavior in the bulk of the society, but not the behavior in the tails. So for the richer people, something else is happening. In order to illustrate the meaning of this power law, I have prepared two transparencies. So in the as I told you, we have these international collaborations. We are essentially, however, working with income data. Why? Because the problem is that essentially the offices of national statistics all over the world, first of all, they present wealth distributions in their publications, but they do not give you, unless you know someone there or you apply for getting the data, they don't give you the distribution of individual wealth that they have sampled. Moreover, the wealth distribution is subject to a lot of sampling errors because they are essentially trying to investigate the wealth distribution by sampling a subset of the population of a country and asking people to write down with a questionnaire what their wealth is. So people who knows what they are doing, yes? So already if you have taxation data which are related to income, they will be flawed by the fact that people are tend to declare an income which is lower than the one that they are earning in order to dodge higher taxes. But for wealth, you have even more problems. However, we have sort of data on wealth on an aggregate level. And however, on income, we have data maybe also even on individual levels. So for instance, these are Japanese data representing the income and not the wealth. But you can imagine that for the wealth, you would have similar representation. And this is the so-called Lorenz curve. So the Lorenz curve is a plot of the cumulative share of income in this case and not of wealth, and the cumulative share of people from the lowest to the highest wealth. So here you are ranking people according to the information that you have, people or households or companies from the lowest to the highest wealth, and here you put the quantiles related to the wealth distribution or the income distribution. I think this is probably it's wealth from Japan. It's not income data, despite what I wrote here, because and these data are taken from some publication where this information was available. So this is a typical representation of income and wealth distributions, where you can then compute indices of inequality, such as the Gini index. So the Gini index would be related to the area between the diagonal and this curve, somehow. And this is representing the behavior. This is really income, on the contrary, because we don't have so far data on wealth at this level. These are hundreds of thousands of data taken from the Japanese tax office, with the income before taxation declared by households, individuals, and by companies. But these are essentially just the tail of the distribution. So what this is, for those of you who know what a logarithm means, this is a log-log plot. So if you have a power law and you plot a log-log plot, you get a straight line. So the straight line that you see here is a fit based on a Bayesian method. This is not an OLS or a maximum likelihood fit, but it's based on Bayesian method. It's a fit of the data, and you can see some regions where the idea that you have a power law in the distribution of income in this case is quite good. So this is what is happening. So essentially models like the models I have presented, they give a realistic behavior for the distribution of the wealth in so-called bulk of the distribution, so the central part, but they do not represent the tails. And I leave you with the question, what's happening in the tails and why is there higher inequality than what we are expecting from chance? And in this case, one answer is that the structure of the society is determining what is happening in this region. Okay, so I have to stop because time is limited. You have seen how you can use data and also large data sets in order to study these problems, and also how to, so I hope I conveyed an idea on how to match the theory with the empirical data, even if I presented a theory for the wealth and data for the income. And yeah, as I told you, this is joint work with a lot of people, two from Sussex, Bertrand During and Nikos Georgiou. 3 people are in the International Christian University in Japan, Taisei Zoji, Lucas Pichl, and Zheng Nan, and Sara Merino Aceituno is currently at the University of Vienna, even if she has a fractional position here at Sussex. So thank you very much, and I stop here. I understand I'm getting questions at the end. Yes, so thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So, unlike the other talks in this session, I'm going to be giving more of a kind of general helicopter view of the landscape of social science research and how we think big data is changing and impacting upon it. So, my name is Lily. I'm commissioning editor at Sage, and I work for a team called Sage Ocean. And Sage Ocean has a mission, and that is to equip social science researchers with the skills, tools, and resources they need to work effectively with big data and new technology as digital methods and computational methods become more and more important to research. Why is this so important? Why are we all here sitting talking about big data today? It's because we live in very interesting and very worrying times. I think we've all been aware for a while now that our data online, our behaviour is being tracked to sell us things, but in the past few years in particular, we've seen that our behaviour and our data is being used in more kind of worrying ways to influence us, particularly to influence our voter behaviour. So big data is impacting upon politics, upon society, upon discourse in really, really profound ways. But a lot of this data is held in the hands of private companies. Many argue if it was in the right hands, it could do immense social good for society. So that's where interventions by researchers are so critically needed. And before I move on, I thought it might be helpful just to kind of recap and make sure we're all kind of aligned on what we mean when we talk about big data. So people wrangle with different definitions. Generally, it's taken to be something that is defined by its volume, its velocity, and its variety. So we're talking about huge, huge data sets collected continuously in real time that exist in multiple formats and states, structured, semi-structured, completely unstructured. And there are a few more kind of definitions there as well. So they're kind of exhaustive, they're really fine-grained, granular data, and you have the ability to compare lots and lots of different data sets in theory. So what opportunities does this bring for researchers? Well, the obvious one is because there is so much data, that's more ways to crunch the data, more comparisons, and that can lead to new insights into human behaviour. So one example I can give is Nike, the company Nike, has a running app that you can use to motivate yourself to exercise and track your kind of running behaviour. And some researchers took data from this app and looked at social contagion and how that plays out in the network and whether a person is influenced and to what extent they're influenced by their friends' exercise and kind of running behaviour. And because they had so much data, this data is being collected continuously in real time, they can scale and zoom in and out on the analysis. They can make it really fine-grained. They can look at the effects of contagion to seconds, to hours, to days, whatever they want. Perhaps, depending on your research design, with a kind of more traditional research design, you'd be collecting that data at discrete points in time. So using big data allows us to kind of answer existing questions we have in new ways, with new insights. But you can also combine big data with your existing methods and your existing data sets. They are complementary. And a lot of people are talking about doing this with survey data, for example, because survey response rates have been declining steadily, and also administrative data. So one really nice example I came across the other day was a study which looked at the content of individuals' Facebook feeds and how they consume news media through their Facebook feeds and how that affects their political participation. And they compared data on that with the self-reporting of those participants in a survey about how they saw their news media impacting upon their political participation. So plenty of scope for combinations. But also with these new data sets, particularly social media opening up, it can offer us new research questions and areas of investigation. So how do cystic fibrosis sufferers use Twitter to talk about their experiences? Or another study I came across was some black communities in Atlanta used and collect data on housing issues, on housing shortages and gentrification, to challenge the state or the county's official portrait of data on housing, which they felt was inaccurate and not tallying with their experiences. So they used kind of data as a form of data activism. But with opportunities, of course, come challenges, and a lot of the challenges occur due to the fact that you're dealing with data that's already existing. It's being collected by someone else. That means it's often weird, meaning it pertains to people from Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic nations. So that means you need to think about how representative your sample is. Is there a lot of bias baked into it? Also, when we talk about big data, we're often talking about social media, and these platforms have a lot of kind of issues and problems that occur with them. So, for example, they often function with the use of algorithms, and algorithms can have all sorts of biases folded in, and they can kind of function as a black box that's kind of inaccessible to researchers. But as researchers, of course, we want to know as much as we can about our data, so that's an issue. Also understanding terms of service and the rules, literally, am I breaking the rules when I collect data from a website, can be really, really tricky. Ethical issues as well become more and more complicated when you're using big data. So if you're downloading data from a website, that data wasn't collected by yourself, it was collected by another entity. It wasn't necessarily collected according to ethical protocol, but as researchers, you still have a responsibility to your subjects. So issues around informed consent, around privacy, identification, secure data storage can be complex to navigate. And lastly, just getting hold of the data can be really, really hard. As I mentioned, this data is normally in the hands of private companies, and they can control who accesses it. Some websites provide APIs, application programming interfaces, that allows you to collect the data according to rules and controls. They completely kind of control the parameters of this and can even shut down the APIs at short notice, locking you out. So that can be a real issue. So, bearing all these opportunities and these challenges in mind, what should social science researchers do to prepare for the future? Well, the first thing is probably, if you want to make use of big data, you will probably have to learn some new skills. And I think there's a kind of growing recognition from universities around the world that teaching data science skills is really, really important. And particularly, we're seeing a lot of undergraduates and younger researchers who are very, very keen on learning data science skills because they feel it gives them the edge in the job market as well. So, for example, the University of California, Berkeley had a new data science course come out, and it was massively oversubscribed. It was their most oversubscribed course ever. So these skills are becoming really popular, and there are kind of two strands to the skills you might want to learn. So firstly, if you're going to be working with really, really big data sets, you'll probably be wanting to automate aspects of your analysis and your data management. That means learning a programming language. And I think there's been a recognition that slowly we're moving away from SPSS and towards R. But another programming language that's very popular is Python. And both R and Python are free, they're open source, they're becoming more and more popular with researchers because they're really flexible and multi-purpose. And there are kind of huge online communities that share resources and tips around how to use these languages. Also methods, depending on your questions and the type of areas you want to investigate, there are new methods to learn. Some of them come from computer science. So examples might be text mining or data visualization to help you make sense and explore big data sets, or machine learning for statistical analysis. Not everyone can learn new skills or wants to, has the time. So collaborations are another way to make use of big data, and the emerging field of computational social science, as it's called, is a really, really right place for collaborations between computer scientists and social scientists in particular. And there are lots of issues and difficulties that come with this, namely speaking the same language when you come from such different theoretical backgrounds, literally understanding each other can be really hard. But the people I've spoken to, the researchers I've talked to who do collaborate, have talked about how it immensely increases their kind of publication output, and they're really keen on collaborations as a way forward. Tools. There are loads of tools out there that can help you with your research. I'd recommend getting to know what's out there and using them to your advantage, and many of these are being created by social science researchers specifically for social science research. So one example is something called TagWorks, which is essentially a way of conducting large-scale text analysis by crowdsourcing thousands of participants who all help to kind of tag up your corpus of documents, speeding up your research. So there's loads of stuff out there, get to know it. And I did talk about ethics earlier, but it's crucially important and really complicated when it comes to big data research. So you're going to have to get to grips with the kind of how that changes your practice, and you'll have to ask yourself really difficult questions about your data, really honing in on issues of bias and representativeness, and are some groups overrepresented, working with your ethical review board, looking thoroughly at issues of de-identification and secure data storage. And platforms as well. It's really important to critically dissect and understand how platforms actually work and how websites are structured, and the commercial and the political interests that are baked into them, because this does affect your data, so don't take it for granted. And I just wanted to say that I've been talking about how big data is going to change the future of social science research, but it won't change everything, because of course there are still existing research questions that we want to ask and study about the world that don't really need the emerging technologies or big data, and that's fine. And I think there's an awareness that big data is actually, for obvious reasons, more affecting the quant realm than it is the qual realm. Just wanted to highlight what SAGE is doing. So we've got a bunch of resources and initiatives to help the scholarly community roll with these changes. So we're publishing journals in the area, like Big Data in Society. We've got a books program around computational social science. And we're also investing in tools and software. So we have a concept grant scheme which offers investment for researchers who are building tools specifically for social science research. So one of the tools we've invested in is called Quandata Studio, which is kind of easy to use interface over the Quandata software package that allows someone who hasn't got any programming experience to use the package for text analysis. Another tool we've invested in is something called Minivan, which allows the visual analysis of networks. And I work on something called Sage Campus, which is a set of online courses, all teaching data science skills, but that are specifically targeted to the needs of social science researchers. So we've got courses on introduction to Python, text mining, there's a bunch of them, introduction to R, data visualization, etc. So thank you very much for your time.
Something completely different. And apologies for being late. I was teaching 9 till 1 in a very different part of campus on a very different subject. Although, funnily enough, talking about privacy and social networking. My students were spying on each other. I didn't tell them to, they just decided to do it. So I'm going to talk about, and I'm a lawyer, there's a couple of lawyers in the room, so I'm going to talk very much about an empirical investigation into how big data can be used for law. It's worth saying, can I move this slide so I can actually see it, rather than twisting my neck all the time? I'm going to be talking about, I suppose the theory is rather straightforward, which is that we all think we have a social contract with the state that we live in, but actually access to law, for those of us who think that we're actually in a relationship of a contractual basis with the state, is actually jeopardized by the fact that we don't actually get access to much law. That which is accessible is very often only accessible in a non-retrievable data form, and is often charged for. The weird thing about what I'm going to do is that it's somewhat nostalgic in two different ways. First of all, I'm going to look at an example of really substantial, effective access to law online. to what we call big open legal data. But secondly, I'm giving you the reprisal of a project that was conducted for the European Commission, looking at how we could unify European law in an effort to make it easier for us to comply in different nation states with different laws under the auspices of the European Commission. So you can understand the nostalgia. This finished in 2016, the project. Understandably, the future has not arrived as quickly as we expected in terms of the overall project, but the project finished just before Brexit's referendum date. Since when the things that we said about the English legal system and its lack of giving people effective access to law have been rather spectacularly proved to be correct in lots of ways. Having said as much, I must say that I conducted postdoc research on English legislation in the late 90s, something called the Broadcasting Act of 1996, and I still have the many kilos of paper of the amendments and the debates and everything else from the mid-90s. And at least when it comes to primary legislation and the debates in Parliament, we're doing quite well in the UK. When it comes to case law, the UK is a disaster at anything except the Supreme Court level. And I'll explain why a little bit later on. In fact, someone remind me if I don't answer the question. So this was a project that was called openlaws.eu. It's been followed up by a project called the LYNX project, L-Y-N-X project, looking at how to build essentially apps that allow people to steer through the law. And I should say this is not just for professional lawyers, this is actually for citizens who believe there is some kind of social contract. Astonishingly, some citizens think they should be able to see the terms of service of that social contract, i.e. what the law actually tells them are their rights and duties, which was pretty much impossible in pre-internet days, and it's still in the UK, as I say, impossible. But nevertheless, in some places it's possible. So what we came up with at the end of it, anyone who's worked on a European project knows that you finish with the big open project title, Bold 2020 Vision, which was how we can unify and produce a pan-European app that would enable people to look at the law in different countries. And essentially this was building on top of the EU and national systems. You may be familiar with some of these European systems, Eurlex, e-Codex, and the e-Justice system overall. I'll explain a bit more about them. Essentially the project was to develop a dedicated EU legal social networks. I should say this has failed. It's failed because actually it turns out that professional lawyers are... the motivations we can talk about. Chance I always like as being a very much overlooked justification for why things happen. Professional lawyers use LinkedIn because they actually don't want to network with each other, they want to network with clients. If they want to network with each other, they have offline opportunities to do so, or within the law firm. So there still isn't anything remotely like a European legal social network, and almost certainly there won't be one either at European or even at national level. The second proposal, which was quite ambitious, was a hub for open access legal journals. The United States has open access legal journals. Europe doesn't have such things, or has very few of such things. There's about 4 or 5 that I can think of specifically. And we're trying to promote all the good things that you would imagine that we would be trying to promote. And one of the things that we were trying to do was to actually contribute to both European and also national approaches towards open data more generally. There is a global ranking of open data for governments, which until 3 years ago, the Open Data Institute is the kind of UK correspondence arm of this, and the Open Data Institute, to whom I presented this work, were very helpful in helping to make sure that governments were always ranked for open data in government generally, publication of policy papers and so on, and also publication of legislation. But as of the last couple of years, there's also been about publication of case law, so that citizens could actually see what it was that there was the interpretation of laws. And the UK suddenly went from top of the rankings, because we have a very effective legislation side, to very low on the rankings because our case law approach is disastrous, as I'll explain. Okay, so a little bit of theory behind it. Some of you may be, well, everyone in the room is probably familiar with Patrick Dunleavy, if only for how to write a PhD. But Dunleavy's actual work is in public administration. And he and Helen Margetts, who until recently ran the Internet Institute at Oxford University, have explained the development of open access in terms of the development of digital governance to some extent. So new public management we're probably familiar with, arising out of privatization and competition and managerialism in the 80s and 90s. Digital era governance, as they saw it, began with essentially sticking websites on government departments. all of which had very incompatible data standards, and there wasn't a lot of open data happening. A couple of classics about things such as the HMRC, which was seen as the flagship. Anyone of us who files tax returns is aware that sort of works even now. Social security database and so on. But government's record is very checkered, because you're probably familiar with scandals such as the fact that, for instance, the Department of Work and Pensions decided to courier by bike a CD-ROM containing 25 million taxpayers' details, including home addresses, social security numbers and so on, in a non-encrypted form, and the package was lost. So your data is now with whichever data worker is willing to pay for it, of course. Okay, Digital Era Governance 2.0, in the period when broadband was arriving for the UK, and so therefore you could build sites that had a greater level of interactivity to them, were very interesting. The interesting thing is that Parliament was very much influenced in its drive towards opening government data, actually by the parliamentary expenses fiasco. Which people may remember, a journalist got access to parliamentary expenses, which then were published. The Daily Telegraph was a newspaper everyone admired, and we ended up in this situation where actually politicians basically decided open data was their enemy rather than their friend, which is a shame. But nevertheless, government helped to launch various different initiatives, including data.gov.uk, which was launched, that's almost 10 years ago now, I come to think of it. Which shows you how slowly the future is crawling towards us. The Open Government License, there is actually effectively a UN model Open Government License, which was designed in part by Andres Guadamos, who I know has given a seminar here before. Those of you who don't know Andres, Techno Llama on Twitter, and you can follow him there. And also I think paperless tax discs is one example, and obviously HMRC's online self-assessment. Digital Era Governance 3.0 has been happening over a period of time. The coalition owned, you see, owns, this shows you this is a slightly dated presentation, owned the idea that open data was going to happen. The Open Data Institute was set up at the beginning of this era. There was an attempt to basically create value for taxpayers without spending much money, so it fitted very much the austerity agenda of the coalition period. Francis Maude, who was an old-time new public management guy from the 1980s as a minister, then became very, very active in open data, became actually an open data evangelist, called himself that. Extraordinary. This is someone who's now retired in their 70s, but was an amazing, transformative presence in the Cabinet Office trying to make things happen. Ministry of Justice, however, is not necessarily very active in open data, and we have a digitalisation of the courts taking place. 2 years ago, the law school at Sussex had the Draper Lecture in London, that's our annual London lecture at the Law Society, in which the Lord Justice in charge of the modernisation process was asked, well, what are you going to do if we digitise all evidence, all submissions to the courts, as well as obviously all judgments, what will you do to publish the judgments? And he said very openly, no one ever thought about that when we invested £1 billion in digitising the court system. Although he also said, and this may come as a joy or surprise to people, that the reason why not is because the position in terms of the copyright in judgments in the High Court is that the copyright belongs to the individual judge. And that is settled law since the Bill of Rights 1689, to ensure that government directly couldn't influence the judgment of an individual judge. So in theory, you have to approach each individual judge and ask permission for each judgment to be published online. In practice, actually, you approach and now everyone's going to just give up on the whole idea of legal open data. In practice, you approach the clerk of the court in each High Court, and they, of course, clear this with the judges to make sure that it happens. So this is not necessarily as promising as it might be. Here's the good bit. Legislation.gov.uk. Our students have no idea that there were such things as statutes printed in the library, because they assume that this is where all law appears, which is actually true in terms of legislation at least. It has been decided by those who know that it was the best legislation open API in the world, ranked number 1 by the OKFN Open Government Standard, that's the Open Knowledge Foundation's rankings. These are the rankings that governments care about, because governments do genuinely care about where they rank on open data, amongst other things. Eurolex has a horrible API by comparison and is rather despicable. But Legifrance, which is the French equivalent of legislation.gov.uk, is case law and legislation. But then what would they know about the Bill of Rights? They were 102 years late on their Bill of Rights, weren't they? So, by comparison, I apologise to French people in the room. I'm trying to be as neutral on Brexit as I possibly can, which is really hard given what I just said about the Telegraph. Case law in the UK, in terms of its publication online, is mainly conducted at the Supreme Court, I should say. It's a wonderful website, and the Supreme Court is very good at publishing its judgments, but mainly constructed by the British and Irish Legal Information Institute, Bailey, which is a charitable foundation which was set up in 1995, and the Independent Council of Law Reporters, that's what the ICLR is. It was jobbing junior barristers who went to court and took notes. Originally it was entirely funded by senior barristers who simply wanted to get ahead of the game in terms of understanding what had been decided in a leading case as opposed to a standard case. And essentially case law is released to these companies. They're both, I say companies, they're both not-for-profits. The ICLR, as you can see, founded 150 years ago. Bailey has had 400,000 documents a couple of years ago. It's, of course, continually building up. By comparison, the Canadian Legal Information Institute, most countries in the world, I think it's now over 100 countries, have a Legal Information Institute, which is a not-for-profit institute dedicated to trying to put law online. And Canley and Ostley are the biggest. Canley, well over 1 million documents. I'm looking at a former Canadian law librarian. Well over 100 million page views just in 2013. Extraordinary success in terms of its funding. Very stable funding because it's funded by lawyers. So Canadian lawyers contribute a trivial amount. I forget what it is. It's $5-6 each, something like that, to ensure that they have access to an extraordinary range of documents. And I should say that this range of documents includes, Quebec publishes something close to 600,000 case decisions a year on this. So when I say 1 million plus, that's 1 million plus actually annually at this rate. By the way, you don't want to know most of these cases because they're simply things like divorce cases, family court decisions, which are of hopefully no interest to anyone except the participants. I should say there was a Romanian entrepreneur who made a lot of money out of publishing Canadian family court decisions with the names added and offered a service where he would take the names off the decisions in exchange for €25 a time. What a bastard. But there we are. Open data can, of course, be misused, and data protection considerations are very important. Because sometimes when I have 2 minutes left and I can start to wrap. The Open Data Institute has become, was of course founded in 2011, become very interested in this. We have the Good Law Initiative, which has been taking place for a little bit of time. Open data has been becoming very fashionable. And we have lots of different ways in which we're trying to see if data can be opened. But here's the European approach, which works better. Working on the basis of the Free Access to Law movement, which is all of these LIIs, these Legal Information Institutes, and also there have been lots of experiments in trying to open. The UK legal profession and particularly academia has been trying to open up access since the mid-1980s. So the BILITA is our conference, British and Irish Law, Education and Technology Association. It's been running now for 34 years. The Electronic Law Journals project at Warwick, where it was in the 90s, started in 93. We have been trying to do things over a period of time. And I'm assuming everyone in their own field has knowledge of the politics of journal publication. Needless to say, we had discussions with Elsevier and others about this particular project. I'll quickly say something about Free Access to Law movement and how it's been working, the development of it. It's worth noting there's been slow but steady progress. The Australian Legal Information Institute, which has been the most active, Graham Greenleaf, who is the godfather of legal information institutes, has been helping to seed legal information institutes in many different places. The odd thing is, the one place there hasn't been much of that, and this is the team that's been involved, including Andres, is actually the European Union. So this 18-month series of case studies that we conducted by essentially interviewing all the stakeholders and running a questionnaire to which 350 lawyers responded, which is actually not bad in terms of getting professional lawyers to respond. Europe, or the European Union, is the one which actually doesn't have a legal information institute. So we looked at the context, the actors and the methods and so on. There is no fully working European Legal Information Institute. You may think that sounds like a bad thing. That's actually a good thing because it turns out there wasn't much need for it because this is the exception that proves the rule. And it's the exception that proves the rule for many reasons. First of all, the other three case studies we've looked at were the Netherlands, Austria, and the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom had the youngest of those three legal systems in terms of the actual publication of the law. Austria's is of extreme ancient vintage. European Union, of course, we date back to 1958. That's the official journal of the European Union. Again, this becomes problematic for my undergraduate students who are not accustomed to quoting page numbers of the official journal, because the official journal is now by law required to be published online, and they simply assume that Europa is where you, or Eurolex rather, is where you go to in order to say this is legislation. In the same way as they have no real concept of chapter numbers for primary legislation in the UK. I have no idea what that might mean. It's actually just the order of laws, of primary legislation that's actually passed public bills. So the extraordinary thing about the way that this works, and there's lots of good things happening recently, but the extraordinary thing is that there are maybe 7 unique aspects that cannot be copied by national law. The first is that, of course, it's, and again, here I'm trying to be very studiously neutral on Brexit as much as one can, it's an unprecedented multilingual economic and political area, in which you had 4 original languages. These are the original languages, of course, of the European Union, Britain being a Johnny-come-lately to the European Union. The precedent-setting Supreme Court worked, of course, in French as the official language. They decided to make access to documentation freely available at production and then for no charge at all. And so this was very, very different to what happened in other countries. And one of the elements of that, of course, is that the acquis communautaire, the body of European law, is what helps us to understand the process of the workings of the European Union. And so therefore it's considered politically essential to make this available as broadly as possible at little to no cost. And so it's very, very impressive, the decision to make the judgments available in multiple languages, the attempt to make sure that, by the way, the European Court of Human Rights has a much poorer record, partly because they have much less money to actually distribute this information as openly as they should do. So there's a political decision to publicise the information. There was an open policy door, because there was a massive expansion in European institutional competences and budgets. I'm not saying it was limitless money, but there was money available in order to make this happen, as opposed to this very much longer and very much more boom-bust cycle that national institutions had to undertake these things. Fourth, joyously, European Union law grew much at its fastest rate from the 70s onwards, at the time when legal informatics was emerging at the same time. So the standards, which are such a bane of other areas, were not such a problem here, although they weren't always perfect by any means. The fifth, precedent for national law. The European system sits above national law, as I'm sure you've heard fractured conversation taking place over the last 3 years. And so it's extremely important to make sure that national the legal profession at national levels were educated in European law. I should say that I think that there is a major problem in the discussion of Brexit, which was that even at the time when I'm getting on now, but I did my law degree in the late 80s, and we didn't have a mandatory European law requirement, even between 1986 and 1989 at the LSE, which is a fairly European institution. We didn't know much about European law. And so this is a problem, because I'm 50 years old, look at the House of Commons, none of us has a formal education in European law. That may explain a lot. It may not, but it may explain a great deal. We're educationalists here, so I assume that we all think that an education would be a good idea for people who are going to debate European law. Yes, this is perhaps straightforward, which is that we're now 28 nations that are affected by these things. Another really important element of the modern development of European law is particularly the fact that in the United States it's been recognised for a long time that federal and particularly Supreme Court decisions have a huge ripple effect in state legislatures and influence the law at a very fundamental level locally. And of course this is now more and more recognised in Europe as well. Very famous case, the Right to be Forgotten case, which is the Gonzalez case, a Spanish case in which a bankrupt was trying to get his search details removed from Google. Of course, it's an infamous case because the poor man is now the most famous bankrupt in the entire history of the world. except for the US president, because of the fact that, of course, he was trying to get his details forgotten, and he suffered something called, I think probably most people in the room would have heard the Streisand effect.
Barbara Streisand.
She tried to stop people seeing a picture of her house. It went badly. And so that happened. Digital Rights Ireland is another similar case, which actually revolves around the Snowden revelations and the fact that it essentially the revelation that our governments were intercepting all of our communications and storing them, not necessarily analysing them, but at least interception from the point of view of storing of those communications, which is still a subject of ongoing court cases. Oh, and then the final thing, which is really important and is often overlooked, which is that you depend, certainly for understanding the meaning of the law, not simply on legislation, delegated legislation and case law, but of course on commentary. And one of the extraordinary elements of European law, the journals are not necessarily more open access than the national law journals, but the number and the volume of law firms issuing very extensive commentary on European law, particularly in areas like competition law, enormously well resourced, including, by the way, vast numbers of American and London law firms who have outlets in Brussels and Luxembourg. So there's a vast amount of information available in order to interpret this. It's not of the volume that you would expect of the US Supreme Court, but it's certainly a very substantial volume. So all of these things are driving towards having a very, very widespread knowledge of an openness of the data available in European justice at the European Union level. And then the case histories are very checkered when it comes down to the national level. But yeah, so that's the situation. And therefore, unfortunately, what I'm giving you is a really good case study of how things should work and can work. But of course, it's the federal exception that proves the national rule, which is that in the much older, much more hidebound histories of national laws, we have very great resistance. You may not be at all shocked to hear that the legal profession, the apomediary lawyers, are highly resistant to the openness of legal data, because they see opening legal data to citizens as restricting their professional privileges and indeed potentially their income, which is, we can recognise this in other areas of open data, but it's shockingly so when you're actually dealing with literally the social contract between the citizen and so on. There we are, that's all I have to say. I hope that's helpful. It's really off the wall in terms of everything else that we've done, but thank you.